Greetings, Danse. Harlan Pruden, Egwa, Wakat Omani, Egwa, Motormouth Mabel, Nisika-san. Niha, nihao, niha, kwe. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden, and my Nichi name, my Indian name, my traditional name, however you want to call it, is Wakat no Mani. It's actually in Sioux. It's a long name. It just, yeah, I'm not going to unpack it, but I'm also First Nations Cree, and in my humble opinion, the best nation in the whole wide world. And I'm also Two-Spirit.
Hi, my name is Teddy Consolacion. I am a researcher at the Two-Spirit Dry Lab and also an epidemiologist at the BC Center for Disease Control. And should we go on?
Yeah.
Yep. And so we wanted to first pause and acknowledge where our work happens. And so the work that we do happens on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am a settler immigrant. My family are immigrants from the Philippines, and I was born and raised on the Ohlone people's lands, which is now referred to as San Francisco. And I would just like to acknowledge that much of this work is only possible because of the invitation and basically support that the First Nations people of BC have granted us. And so just a thank you for the invitation here from HDRN and also from Elder Charles, who gave that wonderful welcoming that led us to, welcoming to this, to these lands, so.
So our time together is, one, we're going to talk a little bit about the misunderstandings of Two-Spirit, the who and what of Two-Spirit. And we'll taking, I don't know why my numbering, it doesn't, so they're all going to say one, all right? What and who is Two-Spirit? Thanks, reconciliation and survey design, getting in better relations. And then finally, reflections on what reconciliation looks like in data collection and management. Why my other name is Motormouth Mabel? Because I'm going to be talking very fast, okay? Because I would love to get to the conversation and the actual dialogue. All right, Teddy.
Okay, so I'm sure everybody in this room has seen this before. This is the gender unicorn. It's a very common teaching tool to separate concepts of gender, sex, and attraction in North America. And so the first thing I see when I look at this is that this concept of gender is quite individualistic. And by individualistic, I mean that the cultural dimension that Hofstede's work from the 1980s is referring to. And so he proposed a framework to describe cultural dimensions, and one of them is individualism and collectivism. And so I focus on culture because culture is a powerful force that shapes our values, our worldviews, and our behaviors. So back to Hofstede's work, individualism is the degree a culture places value on autonomy and self-sufficiency of an individual. So the concepts of self are constant across social contexts. In contrast, collectivistic cultures place value on social relationships and interdependence. So your sense of self can actually vary across social contexts. Oh, you can just leave it. Oh no, go back. In a more collectivistic culture, one's gender would be described around the roles that a person holds in their social groups. The individual aspects are still there, but they're secondary to social roles that one has. These are not mutually exclusive categories. People can grow up experiencing both. And so speaking from my own experience as a child of immigrants from the Philippines, a culture considered a little bit more collectivistic. In the US, a culture considered individualistic. I had roles and expectations at home that were different from those at work and school. So at home, I had to always, the importance was of family and making the group and function better. And all the decisions I made at home were to help that group unit to move forward. At work and school, the emphasis is on my achievements, my degrees, my work. And so it's a very different worldview, but they can still be held in a single individual. And those people are generally said, and it's a term borrowed from linguistics, code switching. And code switchers are basically people that can go through multiple social contexts seamlessly. Sorry, go back. So viewing the gender unicorn, is it easier to see cultural values that shaped this educational tool? So if you look at its breakdown, it's asking, what is your identity? Who am I in my gender identity? How do I express it? What was my sex assigned at birth? Who am I physically attracted to? And who am I emotionally attracted to? So does it make it a little bit easier to see how like a cultural context is going to shape the tool that you make and is going to shape the data that you actually collect at the end of this? So let's look to see how cultural values shape how we collect data. So this is an actual image of a survey that was done in our clinic. And so the STI clinic at BC CDC wanted to know what were the mental health needs, the unmet mental health needs of the people coming in for STI testing. So you can see they start with question 2, they're asked about their gender identity. Next, they ask about trans experience, then their sexual orientation, and finally they're asked to identify as two-spirit. So from a non-Indigenous perspective, this appears to be yet another subcomponent of gender tied to an individual gender identity, or their trans experience or sexual orientation. There is no context or clues around this question to signal that this question is relevant only to Indigenous people.
So for Indigenous people, and here's my motor mouth Mabel, in 7 minutes, keep me on this, okay? What and who is Two-Spirit? I really wish, I love when I go to conferences and I'm given like 20 minutes to do a conference talk. Half of that is explaining what and who is Two-Spirit, because y'all don't have any basic, I'm assuming basic knowledge or an ontological understanding of who we are as Indigenous people and some of our conceptions of gender, sex, and sexuality. So the concept, first of all, this is the closest thing that you're going to get to a definition, but of what and who Two-Spirit is, but it's more of a framework, right? So first of all, Two-Spirit is an organizing tool or strategy and not an identity. It's a way to identify those individuals who are Indigenous to Turtle Island and are sexually and or gender diverse. And I'm doing descriptive language rather than saying LGBT, because those are Western concepts. Two-Spirit doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized or embedded within an Indigenous community, framework, or setting. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Within a traditional setting, Two-Spirit was a gender analysis as opposed to a sexual orientation analysis. For us, we have some nations, yeah, they only had 2 genders, while other nations had 3 genders. Some nations had 4, and there were some documentations of some nations having up to 12 or 10 different genders. How do we understand a world that has more than 2 genders that we're currently working under this regime of man and woman? And then finally, today, most people associate the term with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and the line can go on and on and on. Indigenous peoples. However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, and community members is more akin to this smile. Get my thin side. Community members who are more akin to this traditional understanding of who were we in a pre-contact setting, and then what is the application and the relevancy when it comes to that information or data or way of knowing being. So where did the term Two-Spirit came from? So up until contact and even after contact, for those nations that had did more than 2 genders or non-binary understandings of gender, we had our own words that named, accounted, and identified our Two-Spirit relatives. Like in this talk, when I introduced myself, I didn't say I was a man, Niha Napueo. Nor did I say I was a woman, Niha Asquia. I said, Niha Ayakwe. Ayakwe, that is the identity. So we had our own words within our own language. And then I put 1492, because that's kind of a big year for us, right? That's when CC shows up on our shores and puts the Spanish flag and goes, ha ha, I've discovered you, right? Well, yeah, that's one story. The other counter-narrative is in October 10th or 11th, 1492, the indigenous people of the Greater Antilles, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. So this conversation around individual and collective is what's our frameworks that are in the back? Because those two realities are like either we're discovered or we discovered. We must illuminate what is in the background where we're discovered or we discover. We must keep that kind of conscious. The word Berdache was used, and Berdache is a French word. It's not a kind word. Y'all can Google it and look it up later. And then around 1989, there was a conversation that began at the International Two-Spirit Gathering, which is now 1990, is that we came up with their term Two-Spirit. We wanted a combination of that reflected a balance between masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males and feminine roles and females and masculine roles. And there we get a pivot back to sex and a pivot away from sexual orientation, a gay Indian or a lesbian Indian. It was about your role within society, i.e. gender. So how do we understand a world that has more than two genders? So this list is a survey. I just looked across Turtle Island and I just picked and chose. Each are nation specific, right? So how do we understand a world that has more than two genders? And this is where I'm gonna start talking much quicker. So if I were to make you a part of the Cree Nation, all a part of the Cree, first of all, how does it feel to be a part of the best nation in the whole wide world, right? The way that we broke up our camps is we had two big camps, just like the elder was saying this morning, you know. And so we had over here is our Squia camp, y'all women, y'all gathered, right? And on this side of the room, I'd make you a part of another big camp called the Napweo camp, and that's the fire, keepers of the fire, the men's camp. And the way that us Crees also worked is that y'all, like a man couldn't go into an Squia camp and a Squia couldn't go into a Napweo camp. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two camps, we as Two-Spirit people, we could float over because we had access to the women's camp. We're like, hey, women, what's going on? What's happening, right? They're like, oh. We could float over to the men's camp and we're like, hey, men, what's going on? And we could go back and forth and mediate conflict resolution. A woman couldn't do this, a Napweo, our man couldn't, just us as a Yahweh could do this. So another way of thinking, for those nations that had 12 genders, they had 12 different camps, each providing a role, like our women gathering, our men hunting, and us mediating. So every gender had a distinct role within our societies. And so that's why Two-Spirit, when operationalized an identity, an endpoint is nonsensical. A Yahweh is the identity and the endpoint, and it's going to be nation-specific. So Two-Spirit is going to mean something different because you'll have a different role if you were Sioux. Just us Crees, we were mediators, but for the Sioux people, their role and how they understand Two-Spirit is going to mean something completely different. I've collected about 130 terms, and I've been constantly through the lab building these this database. It's building off of Willie Roscow's work. The Guasala and the Nuchalnath are two words that have not seen in a public discourse in about 75 years. I remember doing this talk and I had a Nuchalnath elder come to me at the end of the talk and they were like, you know, I really wish that my relative would have known of these words before they took their life, because they didn't see themselves in the culture. I'm making of time. The Wiyat is a community that we're working for, and the council member came out with their declaration of saying, Gulma, this is our word for our Two-Spirit relatives. So these words are so incredibly important. For where there's a word, there's a story. But more importantly, there's a word, there's a history. But more important is that there's a people. In the absence of these words, our LGBT Indigenous relatives think they have to make a choice between being LGBT and being Indigenous, Or worse, they're called nasty things within their community, so they run off to an urban setting, only to come to one of the meetings, and if they don't know this word, they get their word within their language. So these are powerful words. So there's only about 20 known historical images of our Two-Spirit relatives. I have stories for every one of these Two-Spirit relatives. Like, I wish that I had the time to unpack that, because it's rich. I put myself in the archive. This is when I was 5 or 4. Okay, my fly is open. I'm like, why did my mama not close my fly? We cannot talk about Two-Spirit unless we understand what's going on in this picture. So this is a picture of the first Indian residential school. It was opened in 1879, closed in 1918 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And if we look at this picture and decode it, you know, in the middle section, I'm going to assume that those are all males or young boys, their gender, and their gender expression is like hair cut over the ear and a pantsuit. And so they're coded as men and young boys. On the lower part of this picture, you have like, I'm going to assume they're females, and you have longer hair and dresses. So what does this have to do with being Two-Spirit? Well, this has everything, and at the same time, it has nothing to do with being Two-Spirit. You're like, hold up, Harlan, how is that? That sounds contradictory. Everything and nothing? Well, if we look, I know there's Two-Spirit people in this picture. I will bet my eye teeth I am that confident. But we as Two-Spirit people, we're not forced to the margins. We're forced completely out of this framework. It is that imposition of that rigid binary gender system that was imposed upon us as Indigenous people. Gone are the third, the fourth, the fifth, or the 10 different genders if you're a part of that nation. And so these schools became like some of the earliest, and I would argue the first, gender conversion sites. Because if you look here, the imposition of that rigid binary gender system, leaving room for only their 2 genders. And that's the violence that we're talking about. And that's the rub of like, how do we redress that harm? And that conversion therapy that happened that washed away like 12 or 10 different genders. So in summary, Two-Spirit is the intersection of those who embody diverse sexualities, gender, both roles and expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island as a community organizing tool or not an identity. It's going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. Two-Spirit refers to a history or tradition that predates Western notions and concepts such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, non-binary, genderqueer, genderfuck, whatever and it goes on. And it is about reclaiming, restoring our place of honor, respect, and dignity within the individual's nations. This is deep decolonizing work that centers one's ingenuity and calls Two-Spirit people home, and thereby is about mending the sacred hoop that we heard our elder opened us in such a good way. Okay, did I do that in 7?
Yes.
Oh, no one's counting. Okay.
Okay. This is the lab.
Yeah.
No,
Am I doing that? Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Okay. So back in 2017, 2018, a group of us, 4 of us, came together at the BC Centre for Disease Control, and we founded this research group that wanted to like solely work on Two-Spirit people and communities, and from a health research perspective. Oh, sorry. We have about 31 lab members. About 54% of our lab are Indigenous, and then the rest are settlers. And so we're a collection of settler and Indigenous researchers. Now I have to go back to my, and although we're trying to develop better ways to do health research that encapsulates Two-Spirit experiences, you know, from a quantitative and survey design perspective, we're also a lab of reconciliation. We're trying to work out so that we get in better relations with one another, both settler and Indigenous people. And so there's this internal discourse and dialogue, but we're also externally focused on how can we do this to be research that is not damage-centered, and that it is working to be in better relations with those that we research but we're also trying to figure out how to be in better relations as settler and Indigenous lab members. So it's just this kind of complex way of working. So a part of that is that we center Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We're a or a multidisciplinary collaboration of Indigenous and settler EPIs, KTers, SOCH, researchers, and just community members that want to come together to join and to help figure out to do better research. We also use Indigenous methodologies and approaches like a two-eyed seeing approach, which was gifted to us by a Mi'kma'ki elders, marshals. Elder Albert Marshall and his wife, or their wife. Two-eyed seeing is basically there are some good things that Westerners brought, like quantitative research. Like looking at mathematical reflections, that's good knowledge. And then what we do is we want that, parts of that. And then the other eye is Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And that knowledge system, and try to put these two knowledge systems, the two eyes, put them into concert that is mindful and respectful. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out as the lab. And then finally, all of our meetings and work is done in the circle. It's how we were formed. It's collaborative, non-hierarchical, and it's also consensus decision-making processes. So I heard that so strongly in Charles's opening today. All right.
All right.
So what does this have to do with research?
So I'm going to start talking about the SextNow survey and 2SDL engagement. And so SextNow, for those that aren't aware of the survey, is often referred to as the gay census. It's Canada's largest and longest running national periodic survey of LGBTQ men's health run by the Community-Based Research Center. As you can see, SextNow survey has gone from a paper-based provincial questionnaire filled out at Pride events to a national survey administered both online and in person in French and English. The 2014-15 cycle the 2014-15 cycle collected about 8,000 respondents. And so from a health equity perspective, SextNow addresses the lack of national data of health of LGBTQ men and has been expanded to capture Two-Spirit individuals. And it's through consultation with the Two-Spirit Dry Lab after the 2014-15 cycle, we prepared a report and assessed the admissions and the survey instruments, and edits to all of it were accepted for 18-19. And just to keep in mind, like, you know, these changes were done in 14-15. They added it 2018, and they're still continued. They still collect this survey. There is a 2023 survey that, you know, they refer to as SextNow, Let's Talk Sex. So these changes that we made have rippled out. So let's look at the SextNow survey in 2015. So the first question they asked was, what's your gender identity? And then they give all these response choices, and you can see Two-Spirit is kind of circled in red there. And then their second question, again, is about your sexual identity. And again, Two-Spirit is listed. And then there's, at the very, very end of the survey, there is a question that asked, what's your race, ethnicity? And so they had just sort of like a general Indigenous response item there.
And when we pulled the data for Debbie was helping pull the data, right? I remember it was like, there were the end value of like 363, or about 4.5 of the sample size were Aboriginal in 2015. And then 156 respondents were Two-Spirit in Q1 and Q2. And I was like, snakes, that's such a great data set. And I was like, wait, Teddy, tap the brakes. How many folks who were Indigenous in either who selected Two-Spirit in Q1 or Q2, how many selected Aboriginal in Q70? And we found that 62% of those that selected Two-Spirit were not Indigenous. And we're like, ooh, this is rather messy. Like, how do you do that, right? And so I'll let pick.
Just that you can see that this is a very typical way of collecting basically data on gender identity and sexual orientation. Again, that idea that these pieces of your gender and sexual orientation can be parsed out into these little pieces, and that it doesn't necessarily need that overall context of like culture, which is a very specific worldview. So when Harlan started talking with CBRC, they wanted to create a way to like build that back in. So
we will be. So will we be, in the next slide, we'll be talking about the method of how to collect Two-Spirit in a much more culturally affirming way that is honoring of this like context. And so we tested this out in 2018 when we were collecting data for Sex Now. And so this is Travis and I from Simon Fraser University, and we were in Montreal. There was a powwow. So while I was dancing, I was like going up to like guys. I'm like, hey, are you 16 or older? Two-Spirit or GBMSM, and if you had sex with a guy in like the last 5 years, as I'm dancing. And there were many straight guys there, and they're like, no, and I'm like, want to? Please, let's dance. But I went to 6 or 8 different prides that summer in 2018. I had rainbows shooting out of my cuticles. I had so much pride that year. But here is on the paper form is this method that I developed in 2005, I think, at the Philadelphia Trans Health Conference. I tested it out there because they were saying, how do we collect Two-Spirit, right? And so what we did, and what I said was like under the ethnicity or the culture or race question is that if an individual selects Indigenous, then they are the only ones that get the question, are you First Nations, Métis, Inuit? Prefer to self-describe, because First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, those are colonial terms from the Indian Act. So they may want to say Nehiyaw. They should be able to describe and honor who they are. And then finally, prefer not to say. And sometimes it's not safe to say. So you always want to give your participants a place to opt out. But then, and only then, like if I'm First Nations, then and only then would you get the question for those participants, are you Two-Spirit, yes or no? So the data.
So to compare this to the 2014-15 question, where you had 62% of people who identified as Two-Spirit, and they weren't actually identified themselves as Indigenous. If you modify the survey in this fashion, what happens is that no respondents are not Indigenous. 100% of the respondents are Indigenous. So this simple skip pattern of embedding Two-Spirit under like Indigenous and making these questions that are about race and ethnicity first so that people can see themselves in your survey, and then going into questions about sexual identity, sexual orientation, because these aren't conflicting identities. They can overlap, they can be in different contexts, but they work together. And so by doing it in this fashion, what you're doing is basically acknowledging and respecting Two-Spirit identity as a social construct that is embedded within Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities alone.
And so a part of that too is the richness. Like I stand before you as a Yahweh, and in English I would say Two-Spirit, right? But when I'm doing my work, you know, for my Cree people, I say that I'm a Yahweh or Two-Spirit. But on Friday night when I'm out at a club, usually dancing shirtless, I'm a gay man, you know, and someone's like, hey, who are you? And I'm like, my name's Harlan, right? And then if they dig in, but I'm not going to be like, I'm not a Two-Spirit person. I am, but like, and so this way that I can select Two-Spirit from how I'm showing up in my Indigenous world, but when going to sexual orientation, now I'm given a space that I can honor my gayness or my bi-ness. And so you're like, how am I showing up in the Western world? And, or if Two-Spirit is so incredibly important for sexual identity or gender identity, I could actually code in or do a manual write-in of Two-Spirit. But you're leaving the participants of like, who are they and how do they showing up on this paper form? So if you want to go to CIHR, type in meet the methods, what and who is Two-Spirit, you'll get this talk. And also the method. Also, a part of like the 2018 survey is this Q50, right? In the past year, which of the following resources have you gone to? Psychiatrists, like clinical psych, sex therapists, or sexologists, and then there's like none of the above, right? And I was like, tap the brakes, right? Some of my Two-Spirit relatives, they go to elders for counsel and also knowledge keepers. Do you see where, had we left the question like that, and as someone who's Indigenous that's going to an elder or knowledge keeper for their mental, spiritual, and physical health and emotional health counsel, that they would be like, yeah, none of the above. And then we run the data and we're like, we got to develop a program. We have to like increase clinical psychs. Like, well, no. They are going and getting services. You just are not asking a right question so that your survey tool reflects the reality of those that you're wanting to engage in a more better way. Do you see how this question becomes incredibly problematic? Data.
Oh, and I was just going to say for that last slide that, you know, basically what we're talking about is making survey questions culturally appropriate. So if we are collecting data that don't reflect the population that we're collecting data from, then what is the use and purpose of that data? And what pictures do those data create? So going on to the next is, this is the case report forms for HIV and AIDS in British Columbia. And so basically, what we proposed in the change, so we changed our case report forms in 2020 and 2021 respectively, is basically what Harlan has proposed. So we do collect Indigenous data, and within the Indigenous data section that we collect information on, we ask the question, are you Two-Spirit? And so this question is only asked to people who are already answering questions on their Indigenous ways. And keep in mind, I work in a government organization, and this had to be approved by senior leadership team, Ministry of Health at BC. All the MHOs of all the 5 health authorities had to agree. This is not like me being an activist and just entering a new question into the case report form. This is like reviewed and agreed upon by a large group of government individuals that, yes, we find that this is an appropriate way to collect this information. So that's really big from our perspective to like be able to slowly take these ideas that were proposed in the CBRC survey and then move that into our HIV and AIDS case report forms.
So within our remaining times, I just want to talk about like decolonizing and challenging some of the pro forma of how research is done. And actually, I was like, after I hit send, I was like, no, I'm trying to change the discourse because I don't want to use decolonizing anymore. What I find for decolonization in that discourse is you run the possibility of a them and us. Like, you settlers have messed it up for us. And you're calling the problem out, right? It's true. But I think what reconciliation is, and if we look at like, okay, we take decolonization, the problem, like how do we uncolonize? And that sounds like a negation, a trickster teaching. And I think the real teaching that reconciliation is calling on us is to get in better relations. Like that's what the end point is. Like, why don't we rally around, let's get in better relations rather than spinning of like, what's decolonization? What's the problem? And that foreclosure of like, you settlers, you messed it up for us, that them and us. We're like, why don't we start rallying of like, let's get in better relations, right? Anyway, so I was like, better relations through research. So here's an apple that's saying, hey, we're both round, we both grow on trees, we're both fruit. That must make us the same, right? And the orange goes, yeah, noodle, we're not the same. But this is how basic research is, all research is basically done.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little side trip because I really like numbers and I do a lot of analyses. And so I wanted to kind of discuss a little bit of like, how do we look at race and ethnicity in analyses. And so the very typical way that this is done is we take that variable that has all the ethnicities, indigenous, Black, Asian, sometimes it breaks it down depending on your demographics, and then it basically runs the model. So everybody knows this. You run the model, and who is your reference group, right, when you run this model? So this is where testing the null hypothesis is problematic to me, because by using that methodology, by taking the race variable or ethnicity variable and then throwing it into a model, making one group the reference, and then seeing how all these other people differ from that reference group, that is basically going to create a narrative of negative, right? So you're gonna see, or that this particular group has more health problems than another. This particular group has increased diabetes, increased high blood pressure. That's the narrative that will come out of an analysis kind of done in this way, because we assume that two groups have no difference, right? We all get taught this in stats, some stats that everyone gets. And by showing that difference, that's when we go further. That's when we start doing like the simple comparisons, correct? Because we saw a difference in the main effect, so now we're doing simple effect comparisons. And so basically what that does is that we're saying then that there is the social inequities that we know and acknowledge, and when we talk about social determinants, we're basically saying that doesn't exist. Here, we're just gonna throw this into the model, and now we're gonna find it. So basically when you do that, you've basically found social inequities, and that's fine if that's the purpose of your analysis, and there are very specific situations where that's noted. But if that wasn't the purpose of your analysis, if you aren't like a First Nation group who wants to advocate specifically for their needs and is showing this disparity, then why are we doing this analysis over and over again to reflect these same kind of like negative narratives that this will inevitably create? And so what we kind of propose, and that is sort of like just forget the main effects. We're gonna go straight into the simple comparisons. We're going to do intra-group analysis. So instead of making that reference group from the Sex Now survey, like a cisgendered white gay male, we instead made it other indigenous people in the survey, and then compared people who identified as Two-Spirit. So what does this look like? So this is a study that we did. And basically, we wanted to know what those nuanced findings would show us. And so we compared the responses of those who used Two-Spirit and compared them to other indigenous individuals who either identified as gay, bi, trans. And then we found that there were significant differences in the drivers of sexual health knowledge. So basically what we found is that rural and urban communities differed for Two-Spirit people in terms of whether they had higher levels of sexual health knowledge. And so in urban settings, it had to do with who your social networks were, and it had to do with whether or not you had Western education. So that kind of gives you some clues of like where sexual health knowledge is being driven, versus in rural communities, none of that was significant when we ran those comparisons.
Thank you very much, Teddy. This is so incredibly important, because that null hypothesis is I was born an Indian, I'm gonna die an Indian. Like I'm never gonna be white. So why compare me and my folks to white people? And all systems have been set up by white people for white people, so they're always gonna have better health outcomes, better outcomes, economically, politically, medically. And so I think it's a false comparison, and that's why we like, and having lab members for us to critically think, how can we do quantitative analysis, but not affirm these systems of oppression? Because when I look at the null hypothesis, it seems like there's a celebration and a lifting up of white supremacy. And then how do we close that gap? Do we make the white folks have the same outcomes as the native folks or the marginalized people? Or do we just have to make the marginalized more like the white people? And for us as Indigenous people, it becomes a site of colonization, potentially. So this is important. Again, what's that framework in the back? So those of us, this is a beautiful saying from Audre Lorde, who, if you don't know, and I'm sure that if you've taken any gender and or feminist class, you've heard the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But I think a better, not better, but a more fleshed out quote from Audre is, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable woman. Those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference. Those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them our strengths. And you see that playing out in the lab, personally, but also politically, of our settler and non-Indigenous lab members. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and we believe that. Taking on the null hypothesis, it's huge. But what we decided to do is we'll let someone else deconstruct the master's house. We'll take the good tools, remember, because we have the two-eyed seeing at like quantitative analysis. We'll like leave the null hypothesis at the door, but quant is good. And what we'll do is we'll just ignore the master's house and we'll go down the street and we'll build our own community and our own village. Let someone else dismantle. So there are some good master's tools, but let's build something rather than deconstruct and try to rebuild. And then finally, how many folks have heard of the theory of syndemics? So the theory of syndemics was coined by Merrill Singer, who was studying, a white cisgendered researcher that was studying HIV within the Latino community within Connecticut, and saw that there was this mutual reinforcing interaction of disease and social conditions, a syndemics, a synergy that propelled the disease or endemic, right? And so when we were doing the Drivers of Sexual Health paper, and it was like, what theory should we use, right? And everyone was like, let's do the theory of syndemics, right? I was like, yeah, tap the brakes. When I go to sweat, I go in and out of the lodge, and my forehead hits the ground, and I say this Sioux expression, mitakuyosin. Mitakuyosin means it translates into all my relations. But a better translation for mitakuyosin, because it's spirit, is everything is connected, everything is related. And you can see from this line drawing by Bruce that everything, the bolt of the thunder and the lightning connects everything, right? It's a beautiful painting. So rather than doing a theory of syndemics for our Drivers of Sexual Health knowledge, we did the theory of mitakuyosin. And we're also being super radical. And we're like saying, hey, Singer, like get some humility. Y'all think you thought of syndemics, but we have a simple expression, mitakuyosin. Like been there, done that. And you can again see the interlockings of inequities, because Singer gets cited as like, I coined this term, like intersectionality, syndemics. Yet we've been thinking about this, and we have simple expressions like that's like nothing. And like Singer gets the posts, the books, and the largesses that the academy has to offer. And what do we get? In and out of lodge, our forehead hits the ground and we say mitakuyosin. And so we're also centering of our own ways, and we show statistically how things are related through the Drivers of Sexual Health knowledge. And you can grab the article. On your table, a little packet on who the lab is, a little paper on who is Two-Spirit, the beginning of our talk. And then actually for this talk is relational accountability. And that is basically of like, how did we collect data? And it's Travis and I's reflection from the picture that we were in Winnipeg for the 2018 survey collection for SexNow. So Two-Spirit, data collection. When collected in a culturally safe and affirming way, health researchers are given the opportunity to promote more rigorous science that considers biological sex and all genders, especially from a decolonial framework or in a better relations framework. Research conducted in a way has the potential to expand our understanding of health within a diversity framework that considers determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disabilities, sexual orientation, goes on and on and on. By bringing these considerations into focus, they can help formulate health research that informs policies, we hope it does, and programs that are more relevant and, I would say, loving, respectful, and mindful ways of being that honors the diversity of our entire population and people. Okay. Yay.
I'm not throwing you out.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Teddy and Harlan, for a very straightforward, plain language, insightful, incredibly thought-provoking presentation. It was loaded with so many things. And so do we have any questions in the room here? We have them right over there.
Sorry. Hi there, thank you. That was really, really, really great. My question is going to be a little bit tangential and kind of spinning off what you had said about advocacy and how it has changed the government system. In the one form of, what mental health care have you sought? The original form was all people who were compensated by either the healthcare system or supplementary health benefits. But as far as I know, there's no, supplementation for Indigenous healers, knowledge keepers. So do you feel as if any of the data that you collect could advocate for the inclusion of, traditional Indigenous healers to benefit from, the healthcare system?
Well, I think that there are models out there that, like if you look at the US VA system, they have a layer of traditional elders, like for smudging, for counsel and stuff like that. So built into the VA system in the US, there is that's happening, right? I do know that that within some of the hospitals in Vancouver, they have resident elders, right? So it's already starting to happen. But I go to ceremony, but I already have my ceremonial community, so I actually don't know how the system is responding and how effective that is. I don't know whether or not we have any evaluation frameworks to see the efficacy of that supplementary or wraparound service that is happening in hospitals or like within the VA healthcare system.
And from what I know is that there are people collecting this data, not us. A lot of our data are coming from surveys that other people are using, and so we haven't been using it for advocacy, but that change is being made already by other groups, Indigenous-led, that are pushing for these services in healthcare, and appropriately so, yeah.
Thank you for that. We're going to go online to Anonymous, who their question, well, I'm going to start with the end of their question. It's great talk. We'll start with that. And the question says, have you had challenges with the concept of Two-Spirit who didn't grow up in their culture and with the meaning of TS in Indigenous teachings that they never received, perhaps defining themselves through a colonial lens without realizing it?
That's the work. Oh my goodness, what a loaded question. I mean, Travis and I, when we were in Toronto, there was a young individual that showed up that I recruited, came over, and they started doing the survey, and they turned to Travis, and they said, hey, what is Two-Spirit? Oh, it's in the paper. If you read the paper, Travis, I think, talks about it. And they're like, oh. So they were like, why don't you, Harlan, you can talk to this person. And I was like, hey, what nation are you? And they're like, I'm not sure. I was like, oh. I'm like, where did you grow up? They're like, oh, in the foster care system. And I'm like, where's your family? And they're like, oh, from this area. And I was like, oh, this is, and I just said the nation name. This is what Two-Spirit would name to you. And I said, I did a brief intervention. But I was like, if you don't know it, just say no. And like, but a part of that whole thing of like, so many folks didn't know, but it was a conversation prompter of like, what is this Two-Spirit? And why am I only getting the question, right? Because being not in good relations, Two-Spirit, that imposition of that rigid binary gender system, that conversion therapy is so powerful within the Indigenous communities that often folks grow up that they don't know that we had multiple genders and that we didn't have same-sex sexual relations. We didn't have same-sex marriages. But many, many nations had that. And so remember the slides where I was like, that word is so important? Because it's so incredibly important, because so many people don't know that there's a word in their language. And that's, you know, and even from like when Teddy was like sharing from the 2018, only 42% of the Indigenous respondents said that they use Two-Spirit. So that tells me, one, they don't know, or they don't like it. Like, what the heck is Two-Spirit? Or three, we haven't done enough programming and enough community education. Like, I don't know. But that piece of data is informing and trying us to figure out what is our agenda. And you can see just from that one little piece of data. But had we not asked it that way, I would not know. I would think everyone's Two-Spirit. Okay, I know that everyone's not. That's it.
Did you want to add anything, Teddy? Or? Yep. Do we have a question from the floor on site here? Amy?
So thank you very much for that talk. It was excellent. My question is really about how you track the changes to these questionnaires. We're finding, you know, as we learn more about, you know, different cultural concepts, we're adding different variables to different data sets, but then we don't have a way to know when those data sets changed and what the significance of that was. And so I'm really curious from your perspective how you're doing that work of tracking, okay, this is when we added this, and this is kind of the narrative, that context around it.
That's an excellent question. I feel like having an excellent data dictionary starts. And so, you know, as you make these changes, you are also tracking why these changes are done and who is at that table. So like if it's at a meeting with CD policy, is it at a meeting with, you know, Two-Spirit individuals who are saying, you know what, I don't really like this question. I think this question should be worded a little differently. That helps like keep record of like sort of those changes. And yeah, that would be, I don't know if you have like other, yeah.
Thank you for that. We're going to go to a question that came from Madeline online, and it says, have you explored the integration or pairing with the term indigiqueer? There are many Indigenous people who are along the gender sexual diversity spectrum that do not identify as Two-Spirit, but do identify as indigiqueer for various reasons.
Yeah, that's a part of the work. I know that in some of our publications, we say Two-Spirit, LGBT Indigenous, and indigiqueer. Like, we're trying to figure that out. And then as like, once you collect that information, how do you do an analysis? And we haven't figured those models out also, right? And to think that we're going to have a moratorium on the null hypothesis, like, that's not going to happen. But we're just trying to draw into focus of what are we actually saying? What is that framework when we employ these tools, right? Or like, what do we do at a very high level when we're doing an analysis, when you have someone who identifies as Two-Spirit in the Indigenous, but gay and non-binary for trans, like how do you manage that data? And we need help. And how do we figure that out? Because there has to be some high-level models to like how do we handle that information so that we can make better informed policy and programmatic tweaks, right? I know that for us within the Two-Spirit Dry Lab is that we just extract the Indigenous respondents and we go deep into the weeds and we only do Two-Spirit to Two-Spirit where we become our own reference group, right? But that I don't think is the reality or like that's a very privileged place for us to work. We have to enter into the research community of like how do we, if we are going to collect Two-Spirit data, how do we manage and how do we do the analyses? And that's where you all would come in incredibly important of like, let's lean into that and develop like a community of practice and support of how do we handle this data so that we're uplifting and working for better tomorrows for our Indigenous and Two-Spirit relatives. And so that may include IndigiQueer, I hope it does, or it may other, like, but we don't have those models right now. And so I think that is where I'm really seeing a huge gap. And we need you all, the research community, to help us with working through that complexity, but also developing those high-level data analysis so that we can actually say something about our communities.
Thank you for that insight. I think we have a question at the back of the room.
Doing here is you're decolonizing the gender narrative, right? Like from a strict binary to non-binary. Now, what about the existing data that might have been collected over the years by different agencies, or how do we translate that? Have you thought about that? Historically, the data might have like somebody just selecting male or female, and now,
Sure.
How do we make sense of that?
Sure. I think you're asking about like when in absence of not collecting Two-Spirit data, like what were the systems that we were using prior to that? This was like, I lived in New York for 20 years and I tried to and I got it funded finally, the Northeast Two-Spirit Society. And so many wacky grant applications because I'd be like, hey, no one is counting us. Like what is measured is treasured. And so when I would go to make a case, this is the awkward conversation. I'm like, hey, let's say X issue, substance use. We know that substance use is impacting the LGBT community or the GLP, however you want to slice it, the L, the B, the LBT tree. This is how substance use looks like within that community. Our Two-Spirit relatives are there. And then this is what substance use looks like within the Indigenous community. And we know that our Two-Spirit relatives are there. So we can safely assume that we're experiencing both of these impacts, but because no one counts us, this is the best that I can do. Or you can give us money that we can count. And for the Two-Spirit Dry Lab is what we've had to do. And so that was like the awkwardness that I've been doing in this game until researchers started counting us. Like literally so that we can be seen in code. And let me tell you, so many folks were like, well, my method wasn't correct. That's a hard sale. Of like, yeah, and it was just ridiculous. And all we were just saying is to see us so that we can then try to like mitigate and so that we can actually try to give that balm to the community around substance use. Did we get funded? Nope. Did it stop us from not doing the work? Nope. Because we just continued on doing it. So our powwow dancing lessons are that we knew that culture can be our prevention, and it can be care, and it can be treatment. that we know, again, this conversation around social determinants of health, that someone who is proud of who they are and that has that self-love, they will make better decisions about themselves. Y'all would not be in this room right now if there was not self-love and that you were proud of who you are. And so how we delivered pride is through celebrating and lifting up our own cultural identities, through our powwow dance lessons, our regalia making. And we knew that that was resonating within Indigenous peoples. Is that health? Yeah, for us it's very, very important. And to get granting around that was so incredibly difficult. And so we just funded it ourselves.
So I think your question is like sort of like for like longitudinal analyses and or, you know, versus a cross-sectional kind of study. And so I think for longitudinal analyses, you know, you really kind of have to start at the point where you think your data is best. You know, you can't, if you go as far back as you have data, which is, you know, the desire, because then you have longer trend lines and you can do, you know, survival analysis and you can do all these fancier models. But if your data is not quite correct, then what is your model actually really kind of giving you there? So in those sense, you know, for us, we're not doing anything as complex as a survival analysis, but so we would start with data from 2018 and move forward just to see what does it look like in the data that we do have. For cross-sectional, it's, you know, again, you work with the data that you have, and so like you have to make these caveats based on how your questions are framed. And so if your data aren't accounting for, you know, two-spirit identity in this particular way, you know, what exactly is that analysis actually saying then about two-spirit health? So it's things you consider, and basically in the end, it's all decisions that you make as you know, a researcher and analyst as you do like your study.
You have a question?
Yeah, thank you for that. So we'll do a quick one online. I think it might be a shorter one. And then our final question of our session will go to Nathan. So the question online says, as you have convincingly demonstrated, words are very important. Which words do you recommend in French?
I am not the person to ask because my big, thick Cree tongue cannot bound around and bend around for my French. But there is a local Two-Spirit organization that's been around for many years. I would reach out to them. I know that the translation of Two-Spirit into French, it becomes a little problematic. Even getting it translated into English is problematic. But I would connect with my French-speaking relatives is to contact the local Montreal-based Two-Spirit organization. They're on Facebook. I also have their contact information. But those are the folks, your local folks, that will best help you navigate what words to use, because yes, words are incredibly powerful.
Thank you for that. So our final question of our session this morning will go to you, Nathan? You've got the mic. I didn't see the microphone. There we go. There.
Thanks. It's somewhat of a mundane question to end on, but I've been wondering it since you shared. So you discussed how you advocated within the system to change how routinely collected data are being gathered, and which is super exciting because we're facing the same challenges in Manitoba. One of the things that popped in my mind as I was listening to you was what work was done to ensure that folks, when they were encountering the system, felt safe to disclose their identity, both their Indigenous identity and their gender and sexual identities, because that's been another challenge that we've faced within the healthcare system.
Sure. So this is a multi-pronged approach, and I have 2 minutes. One is we formed at BCCDC an anti-racism working group. And so for the Anti-Racism Working Group, we celebrate Orange Shirt Day, Indigenous History Awareness Month, and Indigenous Awareness Day. But it's not like a zero sum, because the Anti-Racism Working Group, through my leadership, we celebrate Black History Month. We celebrate Asian Heritage Pride. This year we brought on Islam History Month. And also within the agency, it was us that advocated for a spiritual room for our Muslim relatives. Like Ramadan, we just finished Ramadan. 2 years ago, we witnessed a Muslim relative that was practicing and observing Ramadan and went down into the parkade and was praying between two cars. And we're like, we can do better. Or when there was the mosque massacre, and no one wanted to step up. And our little scrappy Indigenous program, we went out, we bought with our own money daffodils, and we held a little ceremony. And so we're like, show up, be seen. But it's not just see us as Indigenous people. Let's see everyone. In that spiritual room, this last time, the Coptic Christians were working with the Muslim relatives to share that spiritual room. Two big historical enemies. So there's that. There's also the relationship of me walking around and going, hi, who are you? What do you do? And then it's like leadership of like Teddy being seated at tables. We all have privilege of like, hey, what's this method that silly little lab keeps on talking about? But it's just like this web of interconnectedness because I'm constantly walking around this agency of like, hi, I'm Harlan. Who are you? What do you do? Because if they see my humanity, it's hard to oppress. And so within the agency, I work on a very impersonal, and then I work in these networks, and then in networks with like amazing folks. But it's a very complex way of working, if you can see. So, and it's not a guide. It's not like, here, do this. It's just showing up, introducing yourself, getting to know, and being just focused on the relationship. But that's also an Indigenous way. Like, all knowledge is relational. You can have a cure for cancer, but if you have no network to share that knowledge in, or you speak in such a way that no one understands what you're saying, do you have a cure for cancer? No, I would argue. Or the worst is when I see members of the academy that hold and hoard knowledge because they think that that's their power. And that's a place of weakness. You must share because knowledge is relational. And people will remember the relationship, not that you are valued because you hoard this little piece of knowledge. So I think that's, to understand, it's not an easy way. It's just the centering of relationships, and it's going to look something completely different. And then just having and using your privilege.
And I think that one of the keys, at least at our organization, is that we have senior leadership that have embraced, like, going forward. So, the president of PHSA has, changed our goals to like align with North Star goals. So like taking teachings from an elder from Musqueam Nation and using that as, how to shape how we're gonna do work in our organization. And that has led to another group that is about decolonizing like practices. And so like if we can have the nurses and the doctors, be trained in how to have these conversations in respectful ways, that is going to help. So like it's almost like it's not like really one thing. It's just like having these people, and sometimes you never know who's going to be this spokesperson, this advocate. They could be an incredibly powerful person in the organization, and that just moves so much more. But like just starting with like, Harlan's, it's just everybody. Everybody has a conversation with Harlan. It's impossible not to have a conversation with Harlan.
And then just finally is like little simple tools of like film screenings. And like we did like the Angry Anouk, publicly available. We took lunch, offered popcorn and soda, which we paid for. And then a facilitated dialogue so that people can start learning this language of how to say, because so many people don't want to like have frank on conversations with Indigenous folks. Y'all are scared to say the wrong thing, right? So to create spaces and vessels so that you can have those conversations and you can work out that language so you can get the information by asking a good question Or even if you ask a bad question, you know that it's safe and you're still going to get the information. So film screenings is another like a really effective tool that you get people start talking around things like that. It's really looking at the culture of your agency and that attentiveness, and the social change will happen. And so that's, this is such a great question, but it's so complex.